Hello, everybody. My name is Jacek Bartosiak. Welcome to Strategy and Future. And today is our exceptional guest, Elbridge Colby. Hello, Elbridge.
Hello.
Our guest today is a former Pentagon, employee expert that was responsible for preparation of the last edition of the National Strategic Posture. That's what's the final title? What's the formal title?
The National Defense Strategy.
Yes, exactly. That was issued during the Trump administration, and it was a major, as far as I remember, a major change in how the United States was signaling to perceive the world and the environment, to the more hostile, more competitive, the rise of China, and so on and so forth. So here we have the main character responsible for preparation of this strategy, and also additionally the Elbridge wrote a great book that we reviewed at Strategy and Future already a month ago, Strategy of Denial. The book that I personally find very illuminating and very, even scientifically, very concisely and with a surgeon detail describing how you see the world, so to speak. Of course, how our guest today is seeing the world, and I'd like to dive into it in more detail. So, hello again. Nice to meet you. Nice to have you on our podcast. So, let me start by more the question regarding the book. Why did you decide to write the book right now? Sort of, just at this particular moment of time.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you, Jacek. It's a real pleasure to be on your podcast. I know you have a great audience, so really a pleasure, and to be with you as a leading thinker in these issues. And also, thanks for your kind words about the book and such. It means a lot. Why did I write the book? I mean, I think in all seriousness, a strategy like the National Defense Strategy or something like that is at least in my conception, is an attempt to shift how the United States is seeing the world, and then ultimately how it is actually acting, and to be more in conformity with what I think our strategic interests require. But a strategy document, of course, is just one mechanism, which is itself a product of bureaucratic compromise and is neglected or ignored or subverted or interpreted tendentiously. So, I mean, an attempt to implement a strategic shift is something that has to appeal to multiple audiences, not only within the defense establishment, but beyond the political establishment, the influential people, the allies and partners who I think should understand why we're doing and what we're trying to do. And so the book, in a sense, is, I think of it as sort of the Platonic version of the National Defense Strategy. I mean, it's largely consistent, but there are things I've developed much more thoroughly and clearly, and I think with a level of, hopefully, sort of structure and I hope rigor that allows people to understand exactly why and we need to do these things and how we need to go about doing them. And that will allow us to hopefully communicate, or at least debate, with a much clearer sense. I mean, the National Defense Strategy of 2018, there's only an unclassified summary. The actual document itself is, of course, a product of bureaucratic compromise. It doesn't get into high level sort of scholarly concepts or anything like that. So in a sense, what I'm trying to do with the book is to it's a similar, from my own point of view, it's a similar part of the effort as the National Defense Strategy itself. But it's trying to say this is the most clear sense that everybody can understand why we need to do this, why we, the Americans, and those who care about how the Americans act, why we need to do this, what precisely we do need to do, and why it's so urgent. And so that's why I wrote the book.
My impression when I was reading it is that with full breath you were taking all the lessons from Mahan and all famous sea power strategies. It's natural, United States, the sea power. Of course, in the 21st century, that changes a bit, but still, this is a very classic strategy, very crisp strategic book. And I found it a bit reassuring, for myself that you were, responsible for doing all this official document, and now you sort of disclose your ideas in the book of yours, which means that there is still some anchoring of thought. How to address security issues in the world. But my question is, how does it translate into the real foreign policy in terms how probably you were capable of being more open when writing a book, but so what is between writing a book and creating the strategy and then implementing it in the foreign policy from your own experience, as much as you can say, of course?
Right. No. I think it's an excellent question. I mean, to me, it's all part. I mean, as some people say, like almost like a campaign plan for my. I mean, my vocation as a professional is to try to shift our defense and broader strategic orientation. And I mean, I'm very pleased to hear your reaction. I think if we can, I mean, just to kind of go back to your first point, if we can have a common grammar, a common conceptual structure and grammar, then we're more likely to be able to communicate effectively. I mean, I think one of the things that's really unfortunate about American foreign policy, and I think, in all honesty, the current administration has really gone back in a bad way to this, is to have this very hortatory and kind of idealistic rhetoric that doesn't actually match what the world's actually looking like and what it means for, and actually puts our allies and partners potentially in a worse position by concealing and obscuring. Concealing is not the right word, but obscuring what's really going to have to happen in the future. And it's better off, say, I mean, to put it concretely, if Eastern European countries understand the scale of what we have to deal with and the necessity for focus, so that we can all try to then move somewhat in a if not an aligned fashion. Obviously, we're not all going to be doing the same thing, but I think basically we're better off if we're dealing with reality and we're dealing with it in a structured and strategic fashion. In terms of the I mean, the American system, as you know, of course, is very disaggregated. I mean, the national security function of the American government, the founders deliberately endowed it with monarchical qualities. I mean, in the executive branch, they actually go into this in the Federalist Papers. So it has a much more unitary aspect than other elements of American policy. But still, because of the nature of the American system, there are multiple points of influence, especially over time. And so if you take a defense strategy issue, obviously, the single most important thing is probably the defense strategy of the Pentagon, right? But on the other hand, there's the issue over time. There are going to be successive defense strategies. There are going to be successive secretaries of defense and other senior officials. There are members of Congress. And then there are the people who influence them, the opinion writers, the big luminaries of the strategic world or whatever. And those people do have influence, especially over time. And so I think with this book, what I'm trying to do is make it very clear to arm people who are sympathetic with something more developed that they can then use to say, here's how we need to go, and here's why we need to make these difficult choices. Here's why we need to do this. And then to make it, in a sense, harder for the people who oppose it or are uncomfortable to resist it, because they're, hopefully, I'm enough of a believer in the power of intellectual argumentation that I do think it shapes how countries move. I mean, obviously, I think I'm a realist, so I think countries will eventually respond to their interests, but when and how they do so is critical for the resolution of how things will go. So, I mean, that's what I'm also doing it internationally, because Americans listen to our allies and partners. And it's not only a book about what Americans do, because it is about a book, our interests are in effective anti-hegemonic coalitions in the key regions of the world. So it's very important what the Poles do, what the Japanese do, what the Taiwanese do, what the South Koreans do, what the Germans do. And so, it's not just a solipsistic argument to the Americans, which tends to, something about the American foreign policy debate tends to be very internally focused. It's not quite the right word. It tends to be, the big game is often seen to be inside the Beltway and in the big outlets of the American media. But in a sense, we really need the Germans to move. So we should be seeing what's in the German press and in the German language discussion, and similarly in Poland. So I think that's part of what I'm really, really trying to achieve with this book, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that's exactly why I asked the question in this manner, in this fashion, because maybe it's my personal quality, my personal feature, that I would very much appreciate, given the turbulent times that are probably ahead of all of us, to have, for example, the United States president speaking somewhere in Central and Eastern Europe and saying about realistic objectives assessments, and even promising hardship and demands, and even maybe some shortening the fronts here or there, but providing a realistic strategy on moving forward, without empty rhetoric.
Right.
Because if I can hear that, I can make my own judgment. If my partner is approaching things realistically, and it hasn't happened for a long time. And that's why I asked this question about this distinction between foreign policy, grand strategy, and so on and so forth. And that's why I welcomed your book with this crisp assessment, so happily. But not all of people welcomed your book so happily. I follow the discussion that you initiated over Taiwan, because you pose it in your book that United States has to defend Taiwan. This is the anchor of the Pacific strategy, and the Pacific is almost everything. You even advocate for depriving NATO of ammunition. I'm, of course, simplifying it a bit. It's fair enough. This is in line with what I said before, that realistic diagnosis and moving forward. So how do you find reactions to your arguments after you wrote the book? Those two camps: defending Taiwan, not defending Taiwan. Getting rid of this problem, shortening the front also in the Pacific.
Yeah.
Do you expect this level of reactions, or is it too small? Just could you elaborate on that?
Yeah. Well, let me address your first point, because I see things exactly the same way. I mean, I think you're exactly right. I think my book should be reassuring, because it suggests somebody who actually intends to meet the commitments that he is actually talking about, because I'm trying to align not only what we're able to do, but what we're potentially rationally willing to do. And I mean, the current administration talking about sacred commitments and so forth. Well, it's not the rhetoric, and again, I'm not trying to make this a partisan point, but it's not the rhetoric that would reassure me, because I know that I would know that the facts don't match that. And so somebody who's over reassuring when the facts aren't there, and we know won't be there at some point in the future, that's not a reassuring situation. I think we're much better. In fact, I've heard that from actually quite senior European diplomats in Washington. When I present this point to them, they say, actually, it's really nice to hear that, because now I can grapple with this. It's like a business more. And this is the thing. I mean, this idea of like a sacred or this kind of like love affair, the whole transatlantic conversation. I mean, we need to puncture this post-Cold War, sort of way of talking. And I mean, I think Poles naturally understand how tough the world is. I don't need to bring coals to Newcastle here, but I mean, I think there is a dominant sort of conception particularly in the transatlantic world, where it's very anathema to think in these kind of more realistic terms. And I think that's not helping anybody actually in the end, except maybe the Russians.
The credibility gap is widening, and it may be tested. Maybe the Russians are testing it now.
Exactly. And I mean, I could see why they would do that. And we need to deal with that. And I think your point about the munitions is exactly right. We don't have enough munitions. We exhausted huge sums of our munitions fighting ISIS. I mean, we can't. It's a fact. So we can grapple with the fact, and there are limits on our production capacity. If we understand that we lack the adequate production capacity, well, then maybe we could talk about economies of scale and co-production and think about that. And and the Europeans, obviously, and the Poles are already doing this, so applause to you, Poland. But the Germans doing a lot more. There should be tremendously greater political pressure from all of the allies, including the United States, on Germany to step up, which of course is heading in the opposite direction under the new coalition government. So, but that would allow the issues to be addressed in the proper context, which is not what's happening. But I'm hoping with my book to try to and to kind of move into your second question. One of the things I found is that I actually found fewer really full-scale penetrating critiques than I had anticipated. So people kind of are, I find attacking around the edges, and I hope that doesn't sound arrogant, but I don't mean it in that way. I'm actually looking forward to full-scale challenges to the book's whole, but rather I find people going after the Taiwan issue, which is a critical one and is a huge but not the basic idea of the anti-hegemonic coalition or denial defense, or when they do so, I find them very intellectually lacking. For instance, arguments about horizontal escalation as a substitute for a denial, direct defense of Taiwan. I don't think their arguments are very serious. And I'm actually looking forward to it. I hope they come at some point. Jessica Matthews, the former Carnegie Endowment, she wrote a kind of negative capsule review in Foreign Affairs, but it's like she wrote an article in Foreign Affairs a couple of months ago that was like, hey, don't blame China. Like, let's ignore, so it's somebody who's not grappling with, I think, reality in the proper way. I mean, with all due respect to a distinguished public servant and all that, but I just don't, that's not it. Maybe it's coming. I hope so. But I think in terms of, I will say this, I find the toughest argument to be, I get attacked from two sides in general. One argument is that I'm overhyping the threat, that China's not so much of a serious challenge, or that they're not going to use their military power. I will say I find the other argument much more formidable, which is that they are almost irresistible. The notion that I'm overhyping the threat, I think, is kind of empirically disverifiable, because we see what they're doing and it's astounding. And they are the largest economy in the world, other than the United States itself, depending on how you measure it. So these people who are saying that we're exaggerating the threat, they're dramatically building up their nuclear forces. They have the huge naval buildup, missile build, everything. It's just kind of like, okay, those are just facts. The other side is that maybe it's going to be too hard. And I think that argument, especially given that while there's been rhetorical lip service paid to the National Defense Strategy of 2018 and these ideas, and that I haven't gotten direct contravention that much, it's not actually leading to the results that we would need. And I think a lot of that has to do not so much that people directly confront the argument, but that they're so wedded to the unipolar model. I think you can see it, frankly, in the response to the Ukraine situation, or the people talking about bombing Iran again, as if we no problem, we'll bomb Iran and then we'll walk and chew gum at the same time, as people say, which is I just don't think it's as serious. I actually, at this point, I'm like, I can't take seriously arguments that don't reckon with constraint. And yet the default elite narrative in the United States is as if we're still in 1999 or 2008 or something.
Is it really so, or there is some sort of a...
things are improving. Things are improving because they're deteriorating. Mm-hmm. People are more and more forced to reckon with reality. I think it's gotten a lot better. The question to me is our conversation moving, and our actions, are they moving fast enough to deal with the scale of the problems? And there I'm skeptical, not only because of what the Russians are doing and their incentives, but also the Chinese and the Iranians, for that matter. So,
I'll give you the example of why I think realistic approach and communicating it to even your allies is really important. Poland thinks about Russia. Yeah, China is far away. Who cares about China here? So, of course, we advocate that Russia first. Of course, it's out of question that it should be China first for the U.S. For the U.S. power projection, for the U.S. economic system, everything. If you understand how you react to the Eurasian threat, it's always the same. So, simply, we need to reckon with that. And to address it, we need to feel the proper force to fill in the gap, not as opposed to just waiting idly until you change your mind, because maybe the next president will change his mind, or something. This is the mother of the bad policy. That's why I really found your book reassuring, that there is some thinking in DC about really being on par with the reality in terms of how you see the world, right? As always, historically, it's proven that transition from the unipolarity or dominance towards more sort of balanced system with a few poles is always difficult. It's always difficult to grasp and make for the so far leading power, even in the region. So it's always difficult to handle it. And that would go to my next question. Very interesting intellectual three concepts, starting with number one. You provide in the book that, for example, if you pose it in the book, that if you get ready for war, or if you really want to deter, you really need to think how to deter the best strategy of your adversary. Not all strategies conceivable, not the worst for you, the best for them. Would you elaborate more on that? It's critically interesting for Poles.
Sure. Yeah.
Because we always, facing the great powers stronger than us. So we think that we are overwhelmed before we start thinking how to deal with that. And if we realize that it's about the best strategy of Europe, then we can really come up with some good solution to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, first of all, I think you're right. I mean, not to belabor the point, but we're not going to revert to a Russia first strategy, and I think Poland would be very ill advised to press on that. I mean, that's a pursuing a optimal, ideal outcome for Poland with enormous downside risk. And I think it would be a mistake for us. And I say this as somebody who's very sympathetic to Poland. I mean, I think I have the Polish ancestor. Not that it matters that much, but I mean, we're American. But I mean, it's a foolhardy strategy. And of all countries, I think Poland understands better than anybody that you can't rely on these sort of solemn proclamations that won't be backed up or will be inadequately backed up, which is more likely. Yeah. And so I think your frame is exactly the right one, which is reckon with the reality and then develop accordingly, and then make it as easy as possible for the United States to help within that context. And that will allow us a kind of a more realistic, sustainable approach where the U.S. will retain. I mean, I'm all in favor of the U.S. retaining a strong security commitment in Europe, but it should be within that context. So fully agree with you. So, I mean, this is wonderful because you're such a keen reader of the book. And I think this is one of the key, and this really came out of my Pentagon experience, where I would just repeatedly be running into people who would say, well, Bridge, what you're talking about, the fait accompli or something like that, that's not likely. What's likely is that they're going to seize an offshore island. Or, hey, we've got to build this perfect missile shield, at home and spend all our money on that because they could, blow us up at home. And the problem with this is particularly in a defense strategy. And this actually, I should say, one of the kind of sort of lines of critique of my book is, I would say, from the regionalists or the area specialists, whose focus is on, well, we need to know what the red or the country we're watching is likely to do, its strategic culture, and that will allow us to predict. So I don't think that's a good model for macro defense strategic decision making. I mean, if you're the White House right now, I think you should be listening to area experts tremendously about what Putin is likely to do next in any particular. But when we're thinking 10 or 20 or 30 years out, there's such fundamental uncertainty, and the timelines are so difficult that we need to kind of build in a lot of skepticism. And I also think, frankly, the record of prediction of these intelligence sources and deep area specialists has been fairly poor, generally speaking. I mean, if you look at, I think actually you would have been misled, generally speaking, about the future of China over the last 30 years if you'd paid more attention to the area specialists than to the geopolitical focus at the macro level. And that's what we're concerned about here in defense, because, I mean, there are programs that we're building now that will last the end of the century. So there's tremendous uncertainty. And so I think in that context, we need to think about their best strategy, which is sort of their most net gainful. Because sure, Russia could launch a devastating nuclear attack on the United States, but it will get that in return. So, we can deter that without a perfect defense. We know that from the last 60, 70 years of experience, right? It's not optimal. It's not the ideal, but it works. And if we spend all of our money on a perfect missile shield, we won't have any money left for regional contingencies, and China will take advantage. Conversely, if we only focus on the putatively likely, we'll end up spending on these gray zone things, which aren't that important fundamentally. That's why they're in the gray zone, right? Is because they don't cross the threshold where we're willing to use military force. And also, if we neglect the higher escalation options, the best strategy, if it involves the use of military force, well, then they will achieve that advantage. And then they'll be able to have a much more decisive effect. And so that's, that's kind of where I think about it. I also think, there's not only uncertainty about how Red behaves, about how China or Russia would behave. There's also the fact that they may be pursuing the wrong strategy, a less good strategy, but can revert later. And if we're not prepared, when they do adjust, we could be toast if we're not sufficiently prepared. So my view is make sure you get the best strategy right, and then you can maybe cover down on other things. But that's the most important thing.
Yeah, I would add from my own backyard is that historically Russia has been very good at calibrating the political objectives with the military tools. It was not always the case with the United States or even Germany, but Russia tended to not to overdo in their sort of military campaigns, which I think advocates even more for deterring the best strategy of Russia, because it's always about political, as Clausewitz claimed,
right?
It's all about the political objectives, and so you need to simply you need to simply defeat the strategy.
Right.
And I think that was very illuminating for me when I was doing my stuff here, my projects. And also that brings me to another chain of sort of intellectual thought in your book, that we shouldn't discuss an all-out major world war when we discuss this transition or reshaping of the global system, but more of a limited war, because the human nature, because of many factors you have enumerated in the book, why people tend to have the limited war, as limited as it gets, as possible, because they're rational human creatures, and so on and so forth. And this is very illuminating for the Polish society, because we were usually the victim of those great wars, and we were weaker than the adversary, so they simply walked over. It's always huge. The war is always like everything stops. But it's not the case historically.
Right.
Would you just say a few words?
I think you're right, and that's another critique of the book that I don't take that seriously. This idea that a limited war is impossible. I mean, maybe a war would escalate to the level of thermonuclear devastation, but between the two superpowers, but they both we and the Chinese, or we and the Russians, would have the most intense incentives not to get to that point. And the other thing is, we're unlike in the Cold War, particularly the earlier part of the Cold War, we actually can do it. Both the United States, China, or and to a lesser degree the Russians, I mean, we can get into the specifics, but we have conventional forces that operate completely autonomously at the nuclear forces. So it's totally possible to wage a conventional war. And so people have this Cold War hangover. And usually I'm a fan of learning from the Cold War from our and the Polish perspective. The Cold War was very successful. I mean, we won, for lack of a better term, without a major war. But, there were nuclear weapons that were flooded all throughout Europe, and they were deeply intricated into normal military operations, normal wartime operations. So that's not true. And I think, also I think there's a perception, certainly on the part of normal Americans, that the stakes are not as great as they were in the Cold War, certainly in the earlier part of the Cold War, when the strategies were really kind of laid down, and then it kind of was on not autopilot, but it was, it constrained the future. In the 1950s, you had the John Birch Society, who had better dead than red. I mean, that was the, McCarthy. I mean, people were really worried about communism. Obviously, Poland, unfortunately, was very sadly was victim of that. But I mean, it meant people were really willing to go to the mat. I mean, there were nuclear drills in American elementary schools. That's not how people are living today. They barely. I mean, to the extent they're paying attention, it's pretty minimal. So I think this is the reality. And I mean, the experience of the 20th century, I think, could be misleading. I mean, I think, the China, if I were advising Beijing, I would try to replicate what Bismarck and the German Berlin, the leadership in Berlin was able to achieve my favorite example is the course of the 7 years between 1864 and 1871, which was a fundamental systemic change to the European state system, which had not happened because of Napoleon, had not happened in the wars of the Austrian and Spanish succession, et cetera. It did happen because they were able to wage 3 short, limited wars against the Danes, the Austrians, and the French, that achieved a systemic effect that people had opposed and almost didn't notice. I mean,
and they were capable of handling the consequences for the system.
Exactly, which ultimately was terrible for everybody, including the Germans, given what happened in the 20th century. But that's not. We don't want that result. And I mean, I guess even Poland, you could say. I mean, I don't know the history of the partitions that well, but I think it was in part result of kind of limited wars and maneuvering kind of cabinet diplomacy in the 18th century. So I mean, but I mean, I defer to you on that, of course. But I think, you know, a total war would be irrational. We have to be prepared for it, but we kind of are, in the sense that we have enormous latent latent capacity. We have a nuclear deterrent. We have a standing military. Other countries have capabilities. What we need to worry more about is the much better strategy, to get to your point about the best strategy, where they could selectively, use military force decisively or threaten credibly there to do so, and then achieve the system effects that we don't want to have happen.
Yeah, I concur with this argument with my full heart. Also the grammar of the battlefield, the sophistication of the information-based weaponry, where the dominance is seen quickly, and in a cascading effect, the actor that is winning the information, the modern scouting battle, let me put it that way, is quickly winning. And I think that it tends to limit both the application of force, application of violence, because you don't need to bomb the
Right.
cities with people,
Right.
In the factories. You simply need to kill the network, the chain of command. So everything becomes mute, not seeing and not communicating to each other. And then it's over. And the cascading, like in Afghanistan, the cascading effect of falling morale among soldiers when they see on Facebook or elsewhere that other parts are giving up, surrendering. So the plus information campaign, that you can create narrative. You don't need to kill so many people to achieve political success.
Exactly.
The currency on the negotiation table. I think this all strengthens your arguments.
No, I think you're right. I think that's very well put. And I mean, one of the things in the book, I tried not to get into too much, take a position on some of the particular military, kind of deeper military assessments, because A, I'm not the world's expert on it, but B, I don't think I think you could have different views on those topics and still use my book. So I didn't want to unnecessarily alienate people on things that I don't think I have too much to add compared to others. But I think your point about that is right. I mean, if you looked at, the bombing campaigns in World War II, leaving aside, the sort of broader strategic effectiveness of bombing versus other mechanisms. I mean, we couldn't do precision bombing. I mean, especially in Japan. I mean, we just couldn't do it. So we ended up, that was at least the putative rationale for area bombing, and the Japanese industry being this. But I mean, to create first of all, that puts a big moral question when it's not necessary. It's not, if you can achieve precision effects, at least in theory, why would you be doing that kind of thing? And secondly, do we have the industrial capacity? It would take enormous effort for the modern societies, with the exception of China, to develop, these kinds of, very brute World War I, World War II style systems if we stayed below the nuclear level. It's possible. It's certainly possible. But I think I think you'd be more likely to see something like 1940 in the West, where you could have just a very rapid use of military force that would result in a fundamentally different political outcome, rather than this assumption that we would get into this, like, there was this book, I tried to read it, Allure of Battle. I don't really know the guy, but it's kind of arguing against the idea of a decisive battle. And I think countries like the United States and China are not going to get punched in the face and then just give up. But on the other hand, the reason that there haven't been so many decisive battles is because people have been prepared to fight the decisive battle. You know what I mean? So it's kind of taking the result without So if we don't prepare for a decisive battle against, like, the Chinese fleet or the Chinese invasion force over Taiwan, they're going to win, and that will be decisive. And decisive things have happened, using military force to achieve decisive political effects, as Poland knows very well. But I think that's, we want to be prepared for that so we deter it.
Yeah, since we have spoken about limited warfare nowadays, I want to touch the last issue I decided to talk to you about is this burden of escalation. Burden of escalation. I think that the concept that is completely unknown for Poles, at least I haven't found in literature any sort of this, and at least under my skin I felt it. And this is, I was really that was the part of your book that I was reading a few times, okay, because I really wanted to implement it into sort of the things that we are doing at Strategy and Future, confronting Russia and stuff. And that helps a lot in terms of designing the proper deterrence, and especially in current and modern era with information campaigns, narrative. Please say a few things, from some in-depth bottom of your thinking, why you think it's important. How would you, convince the people that this is a critical point of any warfare and thinking strategy of warfare?
Well, thank you. I mean, it was such a pleasure to talk to you, because I mean, you really getting to the heart of the book. I mean, I think the burden of escalation and the writing on that, I think that and this binding strategy idea, which is related to it, are the most, I hope, kind of novel contributions of the book. I mean, a lot of the book, I think, as you indicated at the beginning, is taking sort of tried and true, but somewhat unfashionable, but structures and ways of thinking and applying them to the current. So actually, one of the things, I actually had trouble initially getting the book a press, because it wasn't obviously going to sell a lot of copies, because I told secrets about things on the one hand. It's not a John Bolton memoir, but on the other hand, it's not an academic book. I'm not trying to prove how the world works by using case studies. Rather, I'm trying to take that and say, well, what's good for us, for America, and I think our allies and partners. How do we use that? But actually, it's interesting. There's this sort of gap in the publishing world for that, which is strange. But fortunately, Yale University Press is still in that business. Thankfully, they're a wonderful press. But I think that's what I was trying to do. But I do think I was trying to push the intellectual envelope on these kind of ideas of limited war and the burden of escalation in particular, and how to. So this idea of the burden of escalation, I think, it's critically intertwined with limited war. And if you go back, this stuff was discussed in the 50s and 60s quite a lot, and some extent later. But I don't think it really was fully kind of worked through into our force posture. I think in the Cold War, basically we tended to rely on, the threat that leaves something to chance. At the end of the day, we had a plausible way to get up that ladder. There were limited options, but I think, as Frank Gavin has argued, in a lot of ways, I mean, Eisenhower just flooded the zone with nuclear weapons, and at the end of the day, I don't think the Soviets could ever find a way to initiate a large conflict in Europe without it being too likely to escalate to Armageddon. And that's not the best deterrent. I think we could have had a better deterrent, but it worked. It was enough. But I don't think we want that with China for a variety of reasons I've touched on, partially because I don't think the stakes are high enough or perceived to be high enough. They actually, in some ways, are higher in at least some ways, but not to diminish the severity of the Soviet threat. But I think the burden of escalation concept is really key, and it's actually intuitive. It's basically negotiation, right? Which is a kind of form of negotiation. And I'm a huge fan of Tom Schelling. I mean, he was just a giant thinker, but I would say I'm a kind of a hardline Schelling guy. Schelling tends to be seen as sort of an arms controller, but when you go back and you read some of the stuff, particularly his earlier stuff, it's pretty, he's trying to win, right? I mean, trying to figure out how to make it work. And this burden of escalation idea is that in any negotiation, you can make it more or less difficult for your counterparty to keep going. And if we think that a limited war is what it's likely to be, if we get into a conflict, that we certainly need to be prepared for it. The way it's going to be shaped and then terminated is going to be subject to, the manipulation and the strategy of the parties, because there's no umpire, there are no rules, there are no real rules that we have to abide by. And so what we want to do is we want to incentivize the other guy to stop for whatever reason. And the burden of escalation is this critical idea where it's going to be more or less difficult for China, just to make it concrete, to say, let's say they get defeated in an invasion of Taiwan. Well, we can't stop them from escalating. But if they can find a way to escalate and we have no recourse, let's say they, can completely cut off our trade and we're completely screwed and we don't have well, that's a light burden of escalation. But if the only way they can escalate out is, well, if they escalate to nuclear weapons, well, we have nuclear weapons and we have a good, and they're going to look like the aggressor, which is going to catalyze our resolve and international sympathy. Or if they start attacking trade in Europe, or they expand, same kind of idea, that's going to be a heavier burden of escalation. That's not going to mean they're just going to give up, but that's going to make our job easier to shape and then terminate the conflict. And so I think we need to be much more intentional about that. And this is something also I've tried to introduce these ideas into the Pentagon, but it's very rare, kind of rarefied stuff at this point. And we need to, what I'm trying to do with this book is take a kind of a concept that people understand, I think intuitively, but really drive it home and how it would end up shaping how we would plan to fight, with what, with whom. And that's really, in a sense, probably the most novel contribution is this idea of escalation and just being, because usually when people are talking about escalation, like there's this kind of cottage industry right now that in the academic journals that talks about how if we fought a conventional war, it would be dangerous that we could escalate to the nuclear level with China. And it's like, well, yeah, no kidding, right? I mean, okay, that's the problem. What's the solution? And the solution is, we can't be so afraid of the potential for escalation that we inhibit our ability to actually prevail in the local war that we want to win, right? We have to reconcile these two things. So usually people have kind of maximalist ideas that are unrealistic, or there's kind of implying that we should just neuter ourselves by fear of escalation. So what I think the burden of escalation idea is a way to try to say, we need to win, but we also need to manage escalation in a way, we need to deal with escalation in a way that's favorable to our interests and keep the costs and risks to the extent we can control it in relation to the interest at stake.
Yeah, just if I may, on my personal note, I've played a few war games in the Western Pacific, but Taiwanese scenarios in South China Sea. And all the time when the red team, the Chinese team, played change the escalation burden by simply announcing the quarantine, maritime and air quarantine to everybody, but they called it selective quarantine. That, per discretion, they may let us sail in or fly in, even the U.S. vessels, upon my decision as a Chinese. And then the burden of escalation is on the U.S. and also on galvanizing the U.S. that there might be a world war and the downbreak of the whole global economic system, because the United States wants to show that the quarantine doesn't work. And it has to, to ally, take the Germans and French and everybody and Japanese to accept this risk. And that's a major change. Yeah? That's a major change. So it's not only about seizing Taiwan, but more about quarantining and showing that they are in control of the situation in the United States. That must be this sort of that guy that changes the,
right. Yeah. Well, this is one of the big arguments now in the United States is how much we should invest in a forward defense in Asia. I mean, in the kind of serious military circles, because there are people who think the Chinese are so capable that anything that's forward of the United States, any U.S. forces that are forward are probably going to be toast, and it's a waste. But what that's missing is exactly the point, that position is critical, not only in sort of strict military operational terms, but also from this burden of escalation point. So, for instance, if China knows that U.S. forces have to be taken out in a broader context, that if it allows sanctuary to those forces that are forward deployed, it will be defeated. Well, then it's going to have a strong incentive to go after them. But if it does that, then it's going to make it clearer that it is the aggressor, that it's attacked other countries like Japan, the Philippines, et cetera. I mean, this is in a sense, the historical example I used, well, there are a couple of great historical examples, but one is at the beginning of the American Civil War, my understanding is that the Army wanted to withdraw the federal troops from Fort Sumter, but President Lincoln insisted that they stay because he wanted the Confederates to fire the first shot. And they did, and that actually led to much more support for the war effort in the northern states than might otherwise have been the case, or the German decision in 1914 to go through Belgium, for military operational purposes, which is not crazy from a military planning point of view, but and my favorite example is the Japanese in 1941, where they felt that they judged that it was better off going after the American possessions because it was better to preempt them militarily from an operational point of view. But that led to a result from a willpower point of view and a commitment point of view, especially on the part of the United States, that was far worse for them, even in strict military terms. So I think we have to think about that. So we have to keep the military efficacy criterion, has to be front and center. And I went into this in the book in a way that's kind of speaking to actually the concrete defense planning, that we really need because there's a tendency sometimes people say, oh, military forces, they're for symbols and assurance. And no. We need to win. We need to focus on winning. But what is winning and what does it achieve? And what's our story? What's our theory? In a sense, and I mean, my experience of wargaming, a lot of it is, it's a story, right? I mean, a war is a narrative thing that happens, right? So we need to happen in a way that advantages us.
Yeah,
and that's the burden of escalation. Yeah.
A broad theory of victory,
exactly,
well,
which is not just merely, and not you are not saying this at all, but I mean there is this kind of people that, well, I mean, we can't defend Taiwan at a reasonable cost. We need to redeploy our system. We need a better exchange ratio. Well, that's all true, but if we lose that, and then that political effect in Japan is for them to reduce their military commitment or their willingness to allow us to operate, or in the Philippines, well, that's going to have a military effect as well. So ultimately, the goal, the ultimate criterion is in a sense military. But it's Clausewitz works both ways, and I included I think the fuller quotation from Clausewitz on politics is war. War is the extension of politics by other means. But he actually says every military action has to have the political in its conception, not in the sense of always being restrained. It actually might be more vigorous, more aggressive for political purposes, but it always has to be connected up. And that's what this book, and sorry to go on, but I mean, that's what this book, I think, what I pitched it as being, to the press as being novel, and I think it is that you have all these grand strategy books talking about very airy kind of theoretical stuff or kind of rhetorical, and then you have military analysis. But we need, we're back in a world in which we cannot just dominate everybody. We have to clearly understand how the theory works from this clear sense of what our geopolitical approach is to the level of military employment. And that's what I'm hoping is, and then we can communicate effectively and clearly with our friends abroad, like in Poland. Like this conversation is exactly what I hope to catalyze.
And that summary is the best moment to sort of conclude our conversation, which has been perfect. And thanks to you. Thank you very much, Elbridge.
Thank you. Yes. Pleasure.
Our guest today was Elbridge Colby. Great strategic talk. I hope that I'll, first convince you in the future. Thank you very much. Looking forward to that. And thank you to all the viewers. Stay with us. Stay with Strategy and Future.